Where did low fat come from? Saturated fats promotes production of cholesterol in quantities too large for the body to excrete. Cholesterol is responsible for the blockages causing heart attacks. Total fat intake breeds obesity. Maybe if the idea got around again that obesity is immoral, the fat man would start to think. Eat less marbled meat, fewer eggs, and drink 2% milk. These are the words and ideas of none other than Dr. Ancel Keys, the man that spearheaded the research behind saturated fat that led to a massive fat scare that swept America and is still sweeping America today. Sheila is still alive, and she is in the forefront today, making her second appearance. We associate butter with clogged arteries, fatty meat with heart disease, we get low-fat milk, we get low-fat salad dressing. In fact, if we could bottle it up and sell it, we'd probably get low-fat fat, which margin is kind of halfway there. It's marketed that way, at least. Either way, these associations didn't come out of nowhere. They came from the research that was done in the 50s and 60s. You see, Ancel Keys was a well-traveled man, and he started to make astute observations on how other countries ate compared to Americans, and noticed there was a difference, one that was actually worth looking into. So he launched a massive endeavor that we know as the 7-country study. The study gets a lot of flack, like a lot. I don't care. Quite honestly, I think the undertaking was pretty impressive, all things considered. But undeniably speaking, what came of it was the demonization of fat as we know it, namely saturated fat. This idea backed up from observations of the 7-country study. For example, Finland was known for high-fat diets, and they reportedly had high rates of coronary heart disease. Ancel Keys was passionate, but he was also convinced, and he took his findings and ran with them. The problem is, I'll tell you right now, a convinced scientist going in ain't about to have good science coming out. Sure, scientists help the rest of us mere humans understand the world, but that's also the problem. Scientists, like the rest of us, are just mere humans, and they have their biases. Ancel Keys was, and still is, highly ridiculed because of the way that he went about the study. He was accused of cherry picking, right, including certain countries or excluding certain countries with the 7-country study. He was accused of not sharing all of the information that he found with the public, right? His efforts were at the very least questionable, but it did not matter what his peers thought. He blew up. He found himself on the front page of Time magazine with one big message reaching the public: fat is bad. It's quite the story, and its impact shifted American culture for good. If you're interested in the full story, I actually made an entire video on it. You could check it. It'll be in the description. You can watch that after this one. During his time on top, Ancel Keys came up with what we call the diet heart theory, which goes as such: saturated fat leads to elevated cholesterol, and elevated cholesterol leads to heart disease. In a recent video, I said saturated fat does not lead to elevated cholesterol, and elevated cholesterol does not lead to heart disease. Turns out, I was wrong. Welcome to No Lab Coat Required. My name is Johnny Cole Dixon, and I might as well tattoo the diet heart theory across my chest because at this point, I don't know if it's science or a proverb. Why did I say it was wrong when it's seemingly scientific gospel? I mean, folks that go against this theory are on the fringes of the conversation. It's all fun and games. Everybody's comfortable with you until you start telling folks that cholesterol don't matter. You're getting stripped of your lab coat and laughed out of the room. If you go through the catalog of some of my past videos, you'll see that I don't really make those types of definitive binary hard statements, especially without taking a beat to explain them. But I did in that video, and I didn't get a lot of pushback, and I'm not sure it's because people just thought it was automatically true. I honestly don't think we really know, and we just so happen to be extremely used to nutrition science being really contradictory. Someone's saying something over here, someone's saying the opposite over here. But I promise, by the end of this video, you will know if the diet heart theory is true or not. Let's hop in. First things first, does saturated fat lead to elevated cholesterol? Okay, this is a tough question to answer if you don't know what saturated fat is. Look at it this way. It's a classification. We can have saturated fat or unsaturated fat. We classify them based on their molecular structure. We get all microscopic and we look at the tiny molecules that make up the majority of the fat. The molecules look like this. These tails are known as fatty acids. These individual fatty acids themselves can be saturated or unsaturated in any combination. Just like a Rubik's Cube could have a multitude of patterns, so can a fat molecule, which we call a triglyceride. Now, we actually don't have to be all microscopic to know if a fat is saturated or not. We can actually eyeball it. Butter and coconut oil are saturated fats. Olive oil and avocado oil are unsaturated fats. Can you tell the difference? Let's get a little Dora the Explorer moment here so you can guess. All right, time's up. Answer is solidification at room temperature. Saturated fats stack really nicely molecularly speaking, and this represents a firming impact which yields us fat that are solid at room temperature, like tallow or beef fat. Unsaturated fats have a molecular kink which represents a more fluid impact, which yields fats that are liquid at room temperature, like canola oil. Fat determines structure. Not only does fat determine structure, it's also accurate to describe fat as the structure. Let me explain. Saturated fat doesn't only make our dietary fats more firm, it also influences the makeup of our cells. Saturated fatty acids add that same firmness to cell membranes. Same idea for those unsaturated fats. They directly influence the fluidity of the cell. As we could imagine, we need both. A nice, fine balance. Too much firmness and our cells are going to be hard and brittle. Too much fluidity and our cells are going to be soft and vulnerable. Like my generation. Interestingly though, the body is intelligent enough to auto-balance, right? Auto-regulate this balance. That means that we could eat saturated or unsaturated fats until we're blue in the face and our cells still won't be too soft or too brittle. So back to the first question. Does saturated fat lead to elevated cholesterol levels? Well, how can they? Give this a little bit of critical thought. We just spent the last few moments going over how fat is essentially structure. What is structure capable of influencing? Rhetorical question, look at it this way. Fat is structure of a cell, much like walls are structure of a building. Let's say a school building. Could we imagine the literal school walls influencing the students to be smarter and get good grades? I wish that was the case when I was studying calculus, but we know that there is no possible connection between the school walls and the students' performance. And we're talking about the literal school walls. They just represent the building, how it's made. In saying so, Harvard is no different than the community college down the road here. If we're talking about the walls that make up the building, the reputation, the prestige, the esteem, sure, that's what makes Harvard Harvard, but the literal walls of the building can't influence that. They're just concrete and bricks. Saturated fat, unsaturated fat, they are just concrete and bricks. So how can they possibly influence how much cholesterol is made? Turns out they can't. Hear me closely. The saturation of a fat cannot influence how much cholesterol is made. There's no possible mechanism for it. Okay, hold up. Editing Johnny here, because I know a lot of us are going to get our panties and other forms of underwear in a bunch, because how dare this guy say there is no mechanism behind saturated fat and the increase of cholesterol? Has he not seen the mountains of research? I have, and my eyes are burning. You can check the description for my personal notes. I'll be honest, I don't totally like that statement that there is no possible mechanism. And I'm editing this video right now. I'm just leaving that part in because it's imperfect. And I want to show you guys the process behind scientific reasoning. But what I really want to communicate is that this is where the science is left off. There is zero research, unless someone is making a discovery right now that elucidates a mechanism of how sat fat directly drives the increase of cholesterol synthesis, the making of cholesterol, or how it directly drives an increase in LDL in the blood. There are some feasible models out there of how there can be an indirect impact, but there's no consensus on this. Again, check my personal notes in the, I'm going to make an entire video about where the research and the science currently is shortly after this video. It may be up at the time you're watching this, exclusively for the nerds that want to go a little deeper. You can check that out after. The main thing that modulates cholesterol levels is cholesterol levels. Just like the main thing that determines sodium levels is sodium. If sodium is running low, the body is going to pee a lot less of it out. If a cell needs cholesterol, it's going to call for more or make more. This is how the body works. Every single essential piece in the body that is needed for proper human function is tightly regulated every single second. If something is too low, then the body's going to raise it high or compensate for it. If something's too high, then it's going to get rid of it. That is homeostasis, and cholesterol is phenomenally controlled. I personally have not read of anything with more arms of control than cholesterol. Once we eat it, we can modulate the absorption of it, right? How much of it actually gets into the blood. It can be sent away from the liver can call it back. It can be made in the cells. It can be sent to the gallbladder. It could be stored. It could be excreted. There's so many ways to handle cholesterol in the body. Now, before this video gets real juicy like fruit, let's argue for the diet heart theory. Let's say that every time we eat saturated fat, regardless of context, that the LDL does increase. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, why have we concluded that this is automatically a bad thing and have not at least questioned, right? At least, maybe, just perhaps, maybe questioned if this could be a function of homeostasis. And I'm going to show my bias a little bit here. But why is it that the effects of the fats that humans came up on are not even looked at as homeostatic, but inherently atherogenic, yet the effects of the fats that are relatively new that we weren't consuming prior to the 1900s are heart healthy by default? The saturation of a fat cannot influence how much cholesterol is made. There's no possible mechanism for it. But vegetable oil can influence how much cholesterol is made. All right, let's zoom out, because we know that veggie oils, these seed oils, right, they are primarily unsaturated fat. But we know it isn't the saturation or the lack thereof that actually influences cholesterol. So what's so special about these veggie oils that contribute to cholesterol levels?
Let's take a moment to shout out this channel sponsor.
LMNT. LMNT is an electrolyte drink company that supplies our body with the essential sodium, potassium, and magnesium that we need to function properly. LMNT didn't reach out to me. I actually reached out to them. I reached out to them because the product changed my life. These are my old spikes, my old running shoes. I was an 800-meter runner. The 800 meters is 2 laps around the track, and it's too fast to call it a distance race. It's too slow to call it a sprint, and it's a special kind of HE double hockey stick. It's the most painful race. You can argue with me in the comments if you ran track. But I brought on more pain than necessary during my career. As I was training, I would get these gruesome leg-stopping cramps, and it hindered my progression as an athlete. And honestly, I just wasn't sure what the deal was. And here it is, those of us that move more, use more electrolytes. And I paid the price of not properly hydrating. And I suffered even after I hung my spikes up. I would get these random cramps within my active lifestyle. I came across LMNT and the difference was night and day. I only wish I would have found them sooner. I mean, cramps gone, but it was so satisfying because this was one of the only times that I supplemented with something and felt a tangible difference. Now I drink LMNT just about daily to check off my hydration box. It feels good to get back what I lose after working out. It supports me when I fast too. I like to think they keep me sharp, as electrolytes are the hard workers behind the action of the brain and the rest of the nervous system. If we strip our entire body of electrolytes, we'd be incapable of moving. So these little suckers are powerful, and LMNT is dope because of its ease of use. If you want to try them, you can get a sample pack of all the flavors they have with any purchase using my link in the description below. This goes for everyone, whether you've done this before or not. They also released the best tasting sparkling tall drinks I've ever had. LMNT is absolutely changing the game. If you're looking to supplement in some electrolytes, LMNT is the company that you want to plug into. Use the sample pack to find your favorite flavor. I love the chocolate, citrus, and the grapefruit. I stick to it. Thank you, LMNT, for being a channel sponsor. Let's get back to it. Okay, what's so special about seed and veggie oils and their influence on how much cholesterol is made? Cholesterol is used to make steroid hormones. It's used to make bile. It's used in cell membranes. We know cholesterol as an imperative ingredient in human metabolism. Well, this isn't exclusive to humans. Our animals need this stuff too. Animal cells have cholesterol. We bite into animal flesh. We bite into animal fat. We take in cholesterol. In fact, the fundamentals of cholesterol are so important that even plants have their own version of cholesterol. They're known as plant sterols. You may also see phytosterols. These are the plant equivalent of what we know as cholesterol. When we break down and refine seeds to make seed and vegetable oil, they come with a significant amount of these phytosterols. And this is what they look like. This is what cholesterol looks like. One of the biggest rules in physiology is shape determines function. The body's just one big old puzzle, and the shape of a piece determines where it goes. Plant sterols are so molecularly similar to cholesterol that they actually compete at the site of absorption in our intestines. Johnny, back up, what are you saying? Let's put it this way. Let's say we're eating a burger and let's isolate the patty. It's beef, so there is some cholesterol there. But let's say that it was cooked in soybean oil, which happens to be one of the oils that carries the highest concentrations of these plant sterols. The sterols from soybean oil will actually go down into our intestines and compete and battle against cholesterol for its spot. And guess what? The sterols usually win. When I was younger, I wanted Frosted Flakes and Fruit Loops, but we brought home Frosted Fakes and Fruit Rounds, the generic equivalent. And although the generic is basically one-to-one with the name brand, that price tag always gave the generic an edge. And same idea with the phytosterols coming into the body. That generic equivalent is going to win out. Now, whether or not they are used as this fake yet functioning version of cholesterol in the body, that's a whole nother scientific question for another day. But they undoubtedly antagonize the absorption of cholesterol. And this does influence how much cholesterol is in the blood, but not by the way that we think. It's not really obvious. You see, the liver is actually key here. When the liver senses there's less cholesterol coming in, it actually calls back some of the LDL in the blood. And maybe you heard of LDL as the bad cholesterol. Well, it's interesting because LDL isn't actually cholesterol at all. Cholesterol is actually a passenger that is either in or on the LDL vehicle. Now, let's be a little bit more clear here. We touched on LDL being a vehicle, and it's actually a very specific type of vehicle. It's a delivery truck, and one thing it delivers is cholesterol. But regardless of the semantics, what we know and measure as cholesterol is now being cleared from the blood. And this subsequently leads to the lower cholesterol levels because we can't deliver what we don't have. It isn't that saturated fat increases cholesterol levels. It's that seed and veggie oils actually activate a mechanism that clears cholesterol from the blood. Nothing to do with saturation of the fat, everything to do with the source of the fat. Now, there's a lot of moving pieces here. So blunt statements like the one that I made or that any health communicator may make on the topic don't really do this conversation service because there's just so much nuance to explore. So why would I go on to say that the second piece of the theory is also incorrect? Elevated cholesterol leads to heart disease. Quite frankly, just to start, I mean, this is outdated and dismissive. What we know now, we can build a solid case for disproving this part of the theory. But I don't want to disprove the theory for the sake of disproving the theory. I actually don't care to do that at all. I am way more interested in communicating what's actually going on. So, simple question. What's actually going on? Does elevated cholesterol lead to heart disease? Ancel Keys did what any of us would do. He observed one thing, observed another, and he made what we would call an inference. When I was a young kid, I remember riding the bus and seeing the bus driver flip this big old switch and I would see a green arrow flashing right. And then she would turn right. And I was thinking to myself, oh, you probably got to flip that big old switch before you can turn right. Observation, inference, harmless. But I was not a scientist. I was 9. As a scientist, your inference must come from scientific experimentation. That's the standard. Ancel Keys knew this. So in 1968, he conducted the Minnesota coronary experiment. In the Minnesota coronary experiment, researchers took men and women and split them into 2 groups. One group was given corn oil as the primary fat. Corn oil is 95% unsaturated fat. More notably, it is the highest concentrated in plant sterols out of the major oils we consume. The corn oil replaced everything. It was used for cooking and salad dressings. It replaced butter. The goal was to diminish saturated fat and increase vegetable oil and see what happens. Participants ended up decreasing saturated fat intake by 50% while simultaneously increasing veggie oil intake by 280%. The other group was a control group, meaning there was no direct intervention. Having a control group to compare helps to balance out the results. Said not to be a good study. The participants were put on this diet for 41 to 56 months. Goodness gracious, Johnny, why is this study so long? Well, it's because they were working with over 9,000 men and women. Different timelines, different hospitals, a whole lot of moving pieces, yada yada shebang, you get the idea. But this is shaping up to be a very significant interventional study. So, what did they find? Well, the corn oil group had significant reduction in cholesterol levels. No surprise there. We know this takes place because of the phytosterol mechanism we just talked about. They also found there was a greater and greater increase in the risk of death the more and more cholesterol levels decreased. No, I did not misspeak there. The lower the cholesterol levels dropped, there was a corresponding increase in risk of death. Now, this is an association. There's so much more nuance, right? And other things to consider. Confounding variables, for example, right? These variables that contribute to the results or possibly contribute to the results. And not to mention, this finding seemed to really be driven by those that were 65 and older. But why look at this conundrum? Keyes himself had the evidence in hand that refuted his own diet heart theory. Problem was, Keyes had already blew up. He was already on the front page of Time magazine. That happened in 1961. The message was already out. The momentum of saturated fat's downfall was already rolling, and Keyes was not just going to hit the undo button on any of that, so he never published the study. Yes, you heard me correctly. That's right. We are here retrospectively. The study wrapped up in 1973. We didn't get it until some really smart medical investigators and statisticians dug it up in 2016. So, does elevated cholesterol lead to elevated risk? Here's a meta-analysis study, which is a single study that analyzes a bunch of other studies and pulls together the results. Their analyzation included over 300,000 folks and found with the use of statins and other interventions that lowered cholesterol levels, there was an association. The more cholesterol levels drop, the lower the risk of having a vascular event like cardiovascular disease, a heart attack, or stroke. So, inhibiting the amount of circulating cholesterol, or LDL, can lower risk. And I'm making it sound like some big founded idea, but we can actually find 7, 8 million, gajillion, trillion, thousand studies that communicate the same exact thing. So, if the case is that cholesterol isn't the problem, we have to ask, why do these results exist? Now, we can only answer this question if we know where cardiovascular disease comes from in the first place. Here is a crash course. If you want to go into greater detail about these steps, I got you covered. Skip to 29.55 of this live stream. That's one of 2 live streams we did recently that I believe is the best thing you can find on the internet that really breaks down LDL, how it relates to cholesterol, and so much more. Highly recommend you check out those 2 live streams if you're looking to go deeper on the specifics of this stuff. I'll link those 2 live streams in the description. But knowing this first step is huge. It reveals LDL is diverse. Who would have thunk it? There's about 5 different classifications of LDL to be exact. This matters a whole deal for reasons we won't get into here. Some LDL is more susceptible to this modification than others. This is the missing piece of the LDL, cholesterol, cardiovascular disease conversation. So this modification, what are we talking about? What is it? Okay, so let's put it this way. You guys know I love to make things very simple. You can have in the body LDL or modified LDL. LDL, harmless and benign. It does its job. Modified. Think of modified as an umbrella term. Under it are different things that can happen to an LDL particle that changes it for the worse. Think of it like trauma. Sometimes humans go through an event that changes them for the worst, and oftentimes trauma or the impact of it is permanent. In the same way, LDL can go through this physiological trauma that modifies it and renders it as a threat. And that is actually the first step into thrusting us into the development of cardiovascular disease. Okay, once we understand how cardiovascular disease actually works, it's really no big shock that we see this reduced risk with the use of statins and other things that lower cholesterol or LDL semantics, right? That lower those levels. And you may ask, Johnny, why is it no big shock? Well, that study pulled together hundreds of thousands of people from different studies. And if you guys didn't know, there's no standardization for how LDL is extracted, how it's classified, or the language used to classify it. You and I know the difference between a cupcake and a muffin, but for different researchers in different labs, one may see a cupcake, one may see a muffin, they may end up being classified as the same thing even though they are not. However, even still, they aren't wrong because there's no standardization. So what problem does this present? And I think this is so interesting just in general, right? Because we have this pool of a bunch of different studies, including a bunch of different people. We present the issue of what we call heterogeneity. In other words, we aren't too sure how far or how close from CBD these thousands and thousands of people actually were. But even still, we can bank on a decreased risk, and I'll tell you why. Traffic is crazy in Chicago. The people behind the wheels are also crazy, but some people are sane and harmless. If we intervene and we swiped a significant amount of people off the road, regardless of if they were crazy or sane, of course we're gonna see an overall reduction in accidents. You can't have car accidents without bad drivers, but you also can't have car accidents without cars. Same thing in the blood. If we intervene with a statin or otherwise, of course we see a decrease in death from CBD because we are lowering LDL, whether it's normal or on its way to be modified. To parallel the analogy, you can't have CBD without modified LDL, but you also can't have CBD without LDL in general. Okay, so Johnny, you're doing a whole lot of this talking, but either way you spin it, it seems that reducing LDL or cholesterol semantics, it seems to help. Listen, I don't want us to take focus off of the quantity, the amount of LDL or cholesterol going throughout the body. It matters and is a legit lever to pull. What I want to emphasize is the environment we create within our bodies that determines the ultimate destiny of our LDL particles, if they remain normal or if they become modified. Yes, we can modulate this. Oh no, you're giving me another thing to worry about. No, I'm not. I'm simply saying that it isn't a matter of just quantity. It's a matter of quantity and quality. The amount of LDL, yes, but how it's impacted, an even greater yes. It was never really about saturated fat or cholesterol. Ask me, Johnny, what was it about, Johnny? Ask me. I'll tell you. Sugar. Johnny, what? How do I know you're not making this up? Well, listen, we just know too much about the body and physiology and metabolism at this point to keep falling for the same old rhetoric. In fact, it's a well-explored and defined mechanism in the literature, and I helped us go over it and explained it in a different video. I'll have it in the description. Watch that next. Ancel Keys gave us an oversimplified, miscalculated theory, and it made waves before the internet even existed. So this theory and this way of thinking is embedded in our food system and the way that we see our food. Even still, I was wrong. Asterisk. I hope you guys gained some insight and perspective from this one. I'm gonna get about y'all way.